reconnaissance projects began with Project Delta. About 12 teams of maybe 2 or 3 Americans and 4 or 5 Vietnamese. At one time, that one unit was responsible for 40% of the tactical intelligence produced in the entire Republic of Vietnam. So 2 more reconnaissance projects, Sigma and Omega, were formed to operate under the 5th Special Forces Group, and there were several others under the MACV Studies and Observation Group. And the MACV Reconda School was formed to train the U.S. conventional units in SF recon techniques. Reaction forces responded to this intelligence with a hellborn assault into enemy territory. An operation like this is extremely hairy because you're never sure what will meet you on the ground. Charlie wasn't stupid, and he had been known to stake out likely landing zones with as much as a battalion. On the ground it was hot, and we covered many kilometers. The trick is to get into the jungle undetected. You can do that by not announcing your exact time of departure beforehand. Then you have to vary your route, never go the same way twice, never do the same thing 3 times in a row. If they can't find you, they can't hit you, and you become the ambusher instead of the ambushee. But most of patrolling was a long walk in the woods, and there was plenty of time to think. Under those circumstances, you tend to discover who you really are. You also stumble over a lot of booby traps. This simple punji trap is one of the most common. These troops know that it takes 2 men to carry 1 wounded by these things, and that they are coated with human feces, so they'll infect fast. They don't kill, but by the time a unit has picked up very many casualties from these, it has ceased to be effective. We didn't have much intelligence in those early days, but the VC had spies everywhere. They either avoided contact or massed in overwhelming strength and lay in ambush. The VC, which was who we fought at first, were homegrown guerrilla forces. They were either locals who farmed and worked during the day and massed as guerrillas on command, or full-time units of up to a regiment who fought all the time. Still, they had their roots in the South and were local people. We had just about rendered those units ineffective by 1964, and vacancies in their ranks were being filled by Vietnamese from the north. Most patrols from SF camps were of 5 to 7 days duration, and we usually made a loop of about 100 kilometers. Most patrols were like that. Long walks, punctuated with short violent firefights. We took a lot of wounded, and we usually lost 1 American out of every 2 teams. About 5% killed. There were few big weapons in country at that time, and survival was largely a matter of skill. Later, when the amount of steel flying increased, it became more a matter of luck. It's time to collect the weapons and the prisoners. Our camp strike forces almost always beat the Cong, which is what they were designed to do. They were a militia, trained to fight against communist guerrillas on their own territory. Forces like that aren't designed to take on regular forces like the North Vietnamese Army. Nevertheless, our strike forces did take on the NVA time after time. That they fared as well as they did is a tribute to the training and leadership of the Special Forces with them, because they were always, in that situation, inferior to the NVA in both numbers and weapons. Nevertheless, the NVA tried as much as possible to avoid them, and when they did clash, the result often went in favor of our troops. They almost always kicked ass when they met the NVA. After the attack, there was great relief, because it was you who was alive instead of the other guy. Going in, you feel loose and happy walking, instead of lying dead on the jungle floor. Combat in Vietnam provided few moments as sweet as these, a trek through friendly villages with trophy weapons and prisoners. It was a chance to look really good in front of the locals. When we were fighting the VC, our task was to train the locals to defend themselves and to help build South Vietnam into a viable nation. Capturing a prisoner is a rare opportunity to get valuable intelligence and to get back into the jungle with positive information on the enemy's location and capabilities. Later in the war, we sent out recon patrols with a primary mission to snatch a prisoner. The first Special Forces camp was at a place called Buni Now. The troops making this river crossing were part of that first strike force. They were simple tribespeople just out of the jungle, and they were timid. But in time, they became terrific soldiers. We always controlled the areas we occupied. The tragedy was that there were never enough of us to cover all of South Vietnam at one time. As soon as we gained a toehold in an area, it was declared secured and we were moved out and the Cong moved back in. In 1964, our mission was modified and most of our camps were moved to the border. But they were never all contiguous and the Cong learned to avoid them and flow around them. We inflicted heavy casualties, but there weren't enough of us to stop them. Early in the war, we burned a lot of rice hooches. The idea was to deny food to the Viet Cong. It also deprived the villagers of rice as well. The theory was that the villagers would come into our protected villages and we would provide them with rice, but starve out the Cong. With the Montagnards, the problem was that few of them would leave their ancestral lands. So we stopped burning huts and made friends with them in place, treated their sick, and used them as an intelligence source. The amazing thing was that they didn't resent our earlier practices. The Cong had done far worse things. We know the ways of soldiers at war, said one old chief. With information from the villages, we hit the trail again. Meanwhile, of course, Northern Viet Minh units were being organized into the North Vietnamese Army, which entered South Vietnam in 1965. As the NVA arrived, more and more SF assets were switched to provide strategic and tactical reconnaissance and special raiding parties. In the NVA and VC, as in most armies, quality varied widely from unit to unit, from very bad to very good. Where they had it all over the South Vietnamese was in their leadership. By 1965, the war had become much more sophisticated. The North Vietnamese Army came south with a new family of Soviet and Chinese weapons, and the Americans had developed the most potent weapon of the war, air power.